Greetings everybody, I'm Will Kelly, the creator of this channel, and in this video I want to share with you something that I found online, something called the City of Elizabeth Heritage Survey, which was conducted between April 1996 and April 1997. 1997 of course being the year that Elizabeth amalgamated with Munno Para City Council to become the City of Playford. So this survey was conducted right at the very end of the lifespan, if you like, of the City of Elizabeth, before the City of Elizabeth ceased to exist. It was conducted by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources of South Australia, and I'm going to go through this survey. I'm going to put a link in the description below to the entire survey because it's something like 125 pages long and far too long to just go over it in this video, but there are certain pinpoints I want to share with you and to discuss with you and get your thoughts. Let us know down in the comments what you think of this survey. And for me, it really highlights the abysmal job the early councillors of the Playford Council, the abysmal job they did of preserving our heritage and making sure that, and protecting our history. So I will go through this yeah, we'll see what you think of the kind of job the Playford City Council did of protecting our heritage. So this report on a heritage survey of the City of Elizabeth was financed with the assistance of funds from the South Australian Government through the State Heritage Fund and the City of Elizabeth. All recommendations in this report are the opinions of the consultants, Danvers architects, and may not necessarily be acted upon. And as you're going to see, much of it was not acted upon. So I'm just going to scan down to some of the highlights here. So this heritage survey of the City of Elizabeth was undertaken by Danvers architects for the City of Elizabeth and the State Heritage Branch of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. The findings of this survey will contribute to the statewide analysis of heritage assets, which has been undertaken by the State Heritage Branch since 1983. The recommendations made within the survey will also assist the City of Playford. So obviously by the time they were submitting this, the transition had already happened. Will also assist the City of Playford to amend their development plan to provide protection for local heritage and historic conservation zones. The objectives of the survey are to provide a description and evaluation of the heritage resources of Elizabeth for the purposes of conservation, planning and assessment. The principal aims of this heritage survey are to make recommendations for the entry of places in the State Heritage Register and for the declaration of state heritage areas, provide a list of places of local heritage value for inclusion in the development plan or for other planning purposes, and identify areas which could be declared historic conservation zones or otherwise incorporated into local government planning. So it goes on to say, throughout the survey process, members of the community were invited to contribute suggestions for places and areas of significance. A majority of community input was provided as a result of the Migrant Heritage Survey, a heritage display, and by local community group Friends of the Shedley. And the Friends of the Shedley would actually be very pivotal in saving the Shedley Theatre from demolition. Unfortunately, they weren't successful in saving the Octagon as well. So amongst other things in this survey, there's a little bit of history about the establishment of the South Australian Housing Trust and how that came to be in existence, which was to provide cheap housing. Its initial purpose was to provide cheap housing as a response to the housing shortage in South Australia during the 1930s actually. I think it begins in the 1930s, yeah. So the South Australian Housing Trust was formed in 1936 in response to the need for a consistent standard of housing to be provided for the number of poorly accommodated people as a result of the 1930s depression. The driving force behind the establishment of the trust was Sir Thomas Playford, South Australian Premier from 1938 to 1965. Can you believe that? So like 27 years, 48, 58, 27 years that man was the Premier of South Australia. And again, one of the interesting things about Playford, the City of Playford, is that when Thomas Playford envisioned Elizabeth, before he had even named Elizabeth, there was pressure on Playford to name Elizabeth after himself, the entire region, and he rejected that idea. He did not want the area named after him. There was a competition that was held, and people could submit suggestions as to the name, and the South Australian Housing Trust was still unhappy with any of those suggestions, so they went back to Premier Playford, again asked him if they could name the town after him. Again, he said no. So it's very interesting that the entire area now is named after Playford in exact opposition to his wishes. It's almost as if the people who got together to name Playford either didn't care what he thought or how he felt, or were just completely oblivious about the history of the area that they were coming together to govern. It's very strange. Anyway, moving right along. So there's also some history in this report on Henry Smith, who was the architect and the planner of Elizabeth. So he basically came up with the idea, having modelled his plans on plans from America and in particular England and the New Town movement that was happening in England. So he made the provision of all the parks, things like Windsor Green, and all of the reserves, and a reserve for all the different suburbs, and each suburb having its own shopping centre and things like that, its own school. So the idea of these neighbourhood units of around 5,000 people that would be self-contained and would be very much planned with the pedestrian in mind. So people didn't have to walk very far to get to the things that they needed: schools, medical needs, things like that. Anyway, one of his ideas when he was planning Elizabeth, he knew very well that once Elizabeth had been established, very quickly the surrounding areas would also start to be populated. And one of his reasons for designing Elizabeth in the unique way that it was designed, for example, with all those open spaces and the neighbourhood units and the places like Windsor Green, was so that once Elizabeth was surrounded by surrounding suburbs and new towns, Elizabeth itself would retain its unique physical character. And so a lot of the things that are on this heritage list, once we go through them, you'll see these are the things that he deliberately designed and created, having in mind this idea that it would ensure Elizabeth's unique visual look. And of course, Elizabeth amalgamated with Munno Para to become Playford, and then, his plans were very well and truly undermined by the choices that were made by the early City of Playford councillors. I have no idea how the current stock of councillors in the City of Playford feel about the importance of local history and heritage, but it is certainly very prevalent if you just look at the practicalities of things and the reality of what's been lost and what's been demolished and what's been allowed to sit and go derelict. It's obvious that there has been a serious lack of reverence for local history and the importance of locally listed heritage sites and the preservation of those. So there's a little bit there about Henry Smith for anyone who wants to read up a little bit about him. Now, a little bit further down in this report, we have a little bit of commentary on the actual planning of Elizabeth. So we have here, the plan of Elizabeth has contradictory facets. Like Adelaide and the majority of South Australia's towns, it was conceived and planned before any development had taken place on the site. Another similarity was the significant emphasis on the provision of park areas around and throughout the town. In this sense, it is a South Australian colonial town, albeit a very late one. However, the scale of the project and the way it expresses mid-20th century social thought is a very modern and individual feature of the town. The Garden City and New Town models in England and America provided a new set of ideas to the planners of the South Australian Housing Trust. These planners produced a new concept plan incorporating a design and street plan far removed from the rectilinear, rectilinear, that's from the rectilinear and centralised plans of other South Australian townships. That was embarrassing. Thus, Elizabeth, as a representative of planning ideals and the philosophies maintained by the Housing Trust, has a unique place in South Australian planning and urban history. It is seen as a good example of town planning based on well-meant, carefully considered ideals and principles. However, the resulting urban environment has also produced a number of social problems, which are analysed by Mark Peel in his book Good Times, Hard Times, which I've read and I have a copy of. Easily found online. You can order a copy of that. But despite its relative youth, the City of Elizabeth is a complex urban phenomenon whose development cannot be readily categorised and assessed. Researchers are constantly assailed by a variety of mixed messages regarding the importance of Elizabeth's place in our history and the relative significance and success of its planning. Its main significance lies in its uniqueness as an urban phenomenon. And it has certainly been that. I mean, if you think, even today when people think of the Playford area, they think of Elizabeth. When they think of the northern suburbs, you ask most people who have never been in the northern suburbs or who don't live in the northern suburbs where Playford is, I doubt they'd really be able to tell you, but they'd be able to tell you about Elizabeth. For good or bad, Elizabeth has always had a very unique sense of character about it. It's always had its problems, but it's also, a lot of great things about the area as well. And it's certainly had a very strong character, a very resilient character that continues to this day. It may have amalgamated with Munno Para, and they may have slapped another name on the council district, but that area is still very much thought of as Elizabeth, which, in this 2007, 17, 25 years later, that still hasn't been lost, which is a real testament to the area and its people. Okay, now we come down to the statement of significance. Elizabeth is particularly significant as a unique urban phenomenon emerging from the boom of the mid-1950s. It is a product of both the political and economic agenda of the Playford government and the social and industrial agenda of the South Australian Housing Trust. It is also a manifestation of the social theories and planning philosophies of that period. So, even the physical manifestation of Elizabeth was like a symbolic, it could have stood as a symbolic representation of a period in Australia's history, not just South Australian history, not just local history, but Australian history, post-World War II. Elizabeth was one of those towns that was, created out of nothing, out of a rural landscape in response to the populate or perish mandate brought in by the Chifley government post-World War II, when Australia and South Australia, all of Australia, was seen as being vulnerable because we had a small population and very little industry. So Australia was one of those towns that was created specifically to boost Australia's economy and population at the same time. So we had this town that was, created by the South Australian Housing Trust, who, built houses, built shops, built hospitals, built factories even, and actively went overseas to attract migrants and industrialists into the town. So the idea of the cheap housing was to provide cheap labor so that Elizabeth would be an attractive place for industry to move into. But this was being replicated all over Australia, not just in South Australia, and not just in Elizabeth, but Elizabeth was certainly one of the higher profile ventures in this post-World War II Australia. So physically speaking, all those old sites like, Windsor Green, and fortunately the clock tower is still there, but the original council buildings and, places like the octagon and things like that symbolically today could be a physical reminder of a bygone era. If only there had been, some, thought gone into that and some reverence gone into that. So going on from here, it is also a manifestation of the social theories and planning philosophies of that period. The plan of Elizabeth is a tangible representation of this significance, as are the numerous buildings and reserves erected by the Trust to encourage an economically and socially strong community. These aspects of significance are reflected in the recommendations contained in this report. So basically what they're saying in this report is that the areas and the sites listed of significance are listed as significant as a representation of, not just local history and Elizabeth's early pioneering history, that period between 1955 and 1970 especially, but also of state history and national history. I was very pleased when I read that that was recognized by those who made this report. Although, having said that, they do go on to list nothing in terms of state heritage places. No state heritage places are nominated, which seems like a bit of a contradiction for me, and I would obviously disagree with that assessment, but there you go. That's what they recommended. State heritage areas, no state heritage areas are nominated. Places of local heritage value. The following 18 places are considered to be of interest to the history and development of the City of Elizabeth, and this is where we see what a dismal job the early City of Playford councillors did in preserving the aesthetic history and heritage of Elizabeth, which was once quite a beautiful looking city. The Elizabeth Fire Station is listed on this list, which is great, but it's great, lovely, but every town has a fire station, and it's still standing, which is very cool. Anglican Mission on 91 Elizabeth Way, Elizabeth. I'm pretty confident that is no longer there. I could be wrong, however. Let me know if I'm wrong, or if you know whether or not it is there or not. Elizabeth Civic Theatres, which of course was the Octagon and the Shedley Theatre. So the Octagon was demolished. The Shedley was also scheduled to be demolished, but a local group called the Friends of the Shedley were successful in lobbying the preservation of the Shedley Theatre. As I mentioned earlier, it is still existing, but is kind of unrecognisable in many ways. It's kind of been engulfed by the new Playford Civic Centre. The grandstand at Elizabeth Oval, which today, of course, is called Convenience X, I think. And of course, at some point, it'll be sponsored by someone else and the name will change again, I imagine. But for me, it's still Elizabeth Oval, home of the Central District Footy Club. So they recommend that grandstand be listed as of local heritage significance. Playford Gardens, I believe that is still intact, and Playford Gardens, of course, was named after Sir Thomas Playford, who opened it, I think, in 1977, something like that. Ridley Reserve, we still have that. Windsor Green, now we're not talking about the new Windsor Green, which is a very, very scaled down version of the original, which once stood alongside what used to be John Martin's, and of course right near the clock tower and the former council offices. John Martin's is listed here. Of course, that building is still there. I'm not quite sure what department store owns that today, and when you look at it, it looks very different to what it used to. And of course, it's a department store, so but it's nice. The actual building itself is listed as of local heritage. Elizabeth Public Library, which of course is no more. It was once at number 1 Prince Charles Walk, right next to the council chambers. And of course, you've got the Playford Public Library now at the Playford Civic Centre. Council chambers and clock tower. Do you know that there was a call at one point to tear down the clock tower? I mean, is nothing sacred to these people? The council chambers and the clock tower still exist. Of course, the council chambers are no longer being used as the council chambers. They're kind of rented out, I think, to various different businesses. I did take a wander in there not too long ago, and yeah, I was... It's kind of lost its original charm, of course, because it's just being rented out as office space. The clock tower is still there, and let's hope they never tear that down. Gurin House at Spruance Road. Now, Gurin House was basically the first local community centre in Elizabeth. So local groups such as the Elizabeth Repertory Company used to meet there and rehearse plays and things like that. There were local art groups, and yeah, so a very significant site in terms of early Elizabeth history, and not just Elizabeth history, but pre-Elizabeth, because it was one of the old farm homesteads that existed before the Playford government and the South Australian Housing Trust started buying up all the land in preparation for building Elizabeth. And that house is gone, sadly. And the Elizabeth Grove Uniting Church, I have no idea if that's still there. Former John Ball Club, which I believe is still standing. I don't know if it's still called the John Ball Club, but the building itself is still there, I believe. The Olive Grove, I believe, is still there. The Water Tower is definitely still there. Very symbolically significant kind of landmark for Elizabeth. The RAFA 1200 Club, no idea if that is still there, or to be honest, I'm not quite sure what that is. Maybe you can tell me in the comments down below. The GMH office building, which of course is still standing, but is no longer the GMH office building. And the Rotunda at the Lowell McEwen Hospital. I have no idea if that's still in existence or if it got demolished in one of the many redevelopments. I have no idea. So that's it. So let's have a look. Let's kind of count them. So 18 places. How many are still standing that I'm confident are still standing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 that I'm confident are still standing, and of those, they're nothing like in their original state. For example, you know, the council chambers, the building is still there, but it's not used as council chambers, and it's, you know, used as office space now. And, you know, the other things like Elizabeth Fire Station, again, every town has a fire station. I mean, it's significant, yes, but it's not unique in the same way that Windsor Green was unique, or our original council chambers were unique. I mean, the original council chambers sat, you know, the Elizabeth City government, Elizabeth City Council. I mean, I think those chambers should have been preserved as some kind of, you know, I don't want to say museum, but something of that kind of reverence and significance rather than just leased out. Anyway, so let me know what you think. What do you think of this list? What do you think of the job the Playford City Council have done of preserving our history and of taking this list seriously, keeping in mind that the Playford City Council has been around for a while now, and so all that has been lost on the watch of council members who wouldn't be sitting on council anymore, or at least most of them would be gone. Yeah, check out the survey below, and then maybe, you know, shoot your local council reps a message and ask them if they've seen this report and what they think of it and what they are doing to preserve our local heritage, our local history, and, you know, what's left of it. And because, you know, quite frankly, this shit has got to stop. History is important. It's important to move forward and to evolve, but it's important to know where we've been and where we've come from. It informs who we are today. Try and describe who and what you are without mentioning any of your history, and you just can't do it, you know? And all those brave people who came over from Europe post World War II to start a new life in a town that was, built out of, in the middle of what must have seemed at the time nowhere. Tell me what you think in the comments below and check out that report. And as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it finds you well and happy and doing something in your day that you love to do. And until next time, beautiful people, namaste, take it easy.